good understanding of how to do pre-study, at least to a basic level, and then that's going to make a big difference in class, studying it afterwards. Every aspect that comes after the pre-study is changed because of the fact that we have a little bit better organization in our mind, and it's just a little bit easier to understand the information and put it in place. And again, we're going to develop those skills as we go along. Now, another skill that we're going to develop even further later on is revision, and that kind of forms the other side of it. So if pre-study is what changes and deviates the trajectory early on, then revision is what is there to make sure we're catching anything that we're missing and consolidating our information to a really comprehensive, safe level. So good revision takes a few steps. So again, these are just the basics. You need to be able to do this at least before you can move on. Otherwise, you simply don't even have the equipment, the gear that's stable enough for you to climb anything meaningful. This is the minimum requirement for your gear. So let's have a look at what it takes to do good revision. So good revision is composed of a few steps. The first one is that you actually need to, well, number one, you have to actually do it. So a lot of people will revise very sporadically. They will kind of just wing it. And what that means is that there isn't a level of consistency. There isn't really a system that they're following. You may relate to this if you are just spending time during the week to do your homework and study whatever you can. And then later in the week, if you manage to get some time on a weekend, you look through your notes again, or usually even a couple weeks or a few weeks later, or maybe just before the tests, you're just looking at everything and that's almost like the first time you've ever learned it. And you just cram in countless past papers to fill in all the gaps and somehow manage to get through. So it's a very weak, inconsistent model. If something doesn't go right or if something is unexpectedly more challenging, it throws a huge spanner in the works, and it's just not something that's safe to go off. And it causes a lot more stress than is needed because you haven't done really any good preparation before that last minute cram period. So we obviously want to overcome that by having a set revision schedule. And a good revision schedule that you can follow just as a rule of thumb. And again, we're going to make this more advanced. We're going to tweak it and make it more efficient and effective later on. But for now, this is a rule of thumb that's pretty safe if you don't already have any kind of revision system that you're using, is to just do one weekly revision and then one monthly revision, where at the end of every week, you dedicate time to go over everything that you studied that week. At the end of every month, you dedicate time to go over everything that you did in that month. Now, you may not have that much time because of just time pressure to do really comprehensive reviews, but even a little something is better than nothing. And the idea is that the longer you wait, the more you will forget. And that's just the way that the brain works, is that if we're not revising something, there's a chance that we're going to forget it. And if you learned it really, really well at the beginning, then you forget a lot less. But having said that, most people forget quite a lot in the initial period. So just having that weekly revision tapers off how much we're forgetting, which is going to save us a lot of time later on because we're not just relearning everything that we forgot. So having a weekly revision, even a couple hours that you can spare on a weekend for going over the material for that week, goes a long way. And then same thing, once a month, going over everything that you've covered in that month. Now, if you were to just do the monthly revision, you would need to spend a really long time, and it wouldn't actually be as effective when using these together as a pair. And that's because you'd have so much to do in the monthly revision because you didn't do the weekly revision that this would just take a really, really long time. So we don't want that, and you will have forgotten a lot already by that point. So this monthly revision is a lot more doable when we actually do the weekly revision. So it's important that we actually follow these steps. So that's the first thing. Just keeping a general schedule that you're following and a good rule of thumb before we start touching any of this in a more intricate, individualized way is once a week and then once a month. So how do you actually do the revision? Well, there's this pretty well-known sort of spectrum of revision that we know about, which is often called recognition versus recall. And it's a little bit deeper than most people think. So active recall is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and you may have heard it yourself before, but it's not the be-all, end-all of techniques. And like I said, these are all just basic general tips. It's just the minimum gear required. Just because you're doing active recall doesn't mean that you're actually studying more efficiently. And I've heard plenty of students say that their plan for getting in that top 1% was to use active recall. So let me ask you this. Do you really think active recall is all it takes to get in that top 1% or top 0.1%? The answer is no. Active recall is something that basically any even slightly decent student and learner is going to do. So it's just the minimum requirement. And actually, there's another aspect that we're going to introduce much later in the course, which is called reconstruction, which is even better than active recall. And if you've already heard of active recall and you've heard your favorite YouTuber talk about it, you'll be thinking, wow, I can't believe that there's something better than active recall. But there is, and we're going to be covering it much later on, but you need to be able to do at least this first. So let me explain what each thing is. So recognition is like being able to say, take a $1 coin and look at the $1 coin and you're able to identify, yes, this is a $1 coin. You look at a $2 coin, you can say, yes, this is a $2 coin. You can look at a $10 bill and you can say, yes, this is a $10 bill. So recognition is simply looking at something and understanding that it makes sense, that it looks right. And in studying, this might be like reading through your notes and just understanding in your head that it makes sense. So reading and then just rereading it and just trying to make sense of it. So if you've ever just sat there and as part of revision, all it was you just read through your notes again, that's called recognition. And recognition, it's pretty safe to say, is pretty much useless pretty much all the time. It doesn't mean that you don't get any revision from it. It just means that the amount of revision you get for the amount of time you spend is so low as to just never be a good option when there are so many other more effective alternatives. So recognition is something that we never want to do. We want to veer towards recall. And recall actually means pulling it from our memory. So that would be like drawing a picture of that $1 or $2 coin from memory and trying to get it as accurate as possible. Obviously, just because you can recognize it when you look at it doesn't mean that you'd actually be able to accurately draw it if you had to. So there's a big difference between recognition and recall. And because you're never really having to just recognize things in an exam or a test or in real life, most of the knowledge you use has to come from recall. There's no point actually spending any time on the recognition-based stuff. Now, the area that people still get kind of wrong is that they do something which I call cued recall. So cued recall is not quite the same as full recall. So what cued recall is, it's kind of a mix between recognition and recall. The idea is that you'd read through your notes first, and then you'd close the notes, and then you'd explain it, or you'd talk about it, or answer questions about it from memory. So the second half of that is from recall, because you're doing it from memory. But the first half is actually cueing yourself. But the idea is you also don't have access to those notes in your exam or test or assessment or in real life. So you don't actually know if you would have been able to remember that without having briefly read it. And studies that are done on the cue response pathway neurologically show that it could be only 0.2 seconds or less than 1 second that it takes for you to look at something to trigger a certain memory. But we want to be able to trigger the memory even without the cue. So cued recall can actually trick us into thinking that we can recall it, but then when we enter into the exam, we just have that very frustrating feeling of knowing that we were able to do this in our revision, but for some reason, we just can't get the thoughts out, which is very frustrating, and that's because often people use cued recall. So we want to use full recall instead. And full recall, there aren't so many studies that are done on this, but in my experience personally and working with my students to see what works, I generally find that you want to have a 48-hour gap between the last time you laid eyes on the material versus when you're actually trying to recall it and use it and solve problems or explain it. So 48 hours, that means that when you're starting your revision, don't read through everything and then do it piece by piece. Just keep everything closed. Don't look at it to begin with. Just start with a recall and see what you're able to find. And you'll probably find that if you've been doing cued recall this entire time, there's another big difference between cued recall and full recall. So when we're doing our weekly and monthly revision, like we've got on our schedule here, we want to make sure that every week and every month we are trying to do some form of recall as the revision that we're using. And when we're using the recall, we want to try to recall it in slightly different ways. We might explain it one time, we might write it out, we might do a mind map, we could draw it, we could teach it to someone else, we could ask practice questions or practice papers. In terms of the exact strategy of what to do, we're going to flesh that out a lot more later. But for now, don't worry too much about how you're revising. Just make sure you're following these guidelines. And when you're able to do this very comfortably, you'll be ready with the minimum gear required to climb a little bit higher and learn a slightly more advanced technique. But again, if you climb too fast, you're going to enter into that death zone. Now, as a side note, some of you may realize that this once a week revision and then this once a month revision is very similar to this concept called spaced repetition. And spaced repetition simply means that you learn something for the first time, which we can represent with this star. If that's the first time that we learn it, then the next time that we revise it, there is a space, just a gap in time. This could be a few days, 1 day, a week, and that's the first time that we revise it. There's another space, and then we revise it again. And spaced repetition is basically a way of revising that says that you know you're going to forget things over time, and it's much better to not forget than it is to relearn something that you let yourself forget. So keeping to this once a week and then once a month revision schedule is a very simple, not perfectly optimized, but for a beginner, perfectly good starter for having some basic spaced repetition in your study routine.